This is the most not safe for work book I've ever read. And I've read George Bataille's The Story of the Eye. Péter Nádas makes Bataille feel tame. Parallel Stories is like if James Joyce had a Tumblr account and wrote fan fiction of Tolstoy, or if Robert Musil and E.L. James wrote a collaborative book. Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about the first volume in Péter Nádas's Parallel Stories, translated from the Hungarian by Imre Goldstein. This is a book that I wasn't planning on reading anytime soon. This book is an absolute behemoth. It's like 1,150 pages. It's about 60 hours in audiobook format. It's War and Peace level scope and length. And that's actually a book that it's compared to quite frequently. But I kept coming across it online as a 21st century maximalist book. And so I found a used copy of it, and I expected it to just kind of sit on my shelves. I thought it would just look nice on my shelves and make me look kind of smart because it's, you know, a massive work. And then this past weekend, I made the mistake of opening it and reading the first couple of pages just to see what it was all about. And I got completely absorbed. I read the first volume, the first like 330 odd pages of it, in like 2.5 days. I absolutely just devoured it. Whether it's the prose style or just the fact that I have way too many student papers to grade this week, I'm not entirely sure yet. But before I start this video, I do want to say that this probably isn't going to be a review in sort of the traditional sense. I mean, I already kind of stressed the word review quite a bit in most of my other videos, as most of them aren't really reviews. But this, I don't have an argument to be made. I don't understand this book. As I'm sure will be made clear presently, this is one of the strangest books I've ever read. But I thought that this might be a nice and informal way of kind of talking through this book and processing it out loud. And I don't really think that by the end of this, by the end of the 1,200 odd pages that this book has, I don't think I would come out of this with a single argument or the ability to make a single like 15 to 20 minute video out of. So I figured I would split this book up into 3 parts, as it is split up into 3 different volumes. And I would make a quick video after each volume in which I kind of just process this book, note some things that I found interesting or things that I want to talk about more. So what is Parallel Stories? Parallel Stories is just epic in scope. It has, you know, in the maximalist sense, it has, you know, dozens of characters, dozens or more storylines, and they're all kind of woven together, right? Obviously, the name of the book is Parallel Stories. These stories are kind of parallel, but it's much more of a kind of yarn ball, I think, as William T. Vollmann called this book. Much less parallel stories and more a ball of spaghetti, I think was the metaphor he used. And in the kind of modernist sense, this book jumps back and forth between all of these different characters. We have an omniscient narrator, and we often move between characters in the same scene. You know, there are no quotation marks, so it's very unclear often the distinction between when someone is thinking versus when they're speaking. It's often unclear who is speaking or who is thinking. So we have all of these jumps. It's kind of a complete jumbled mess. But most of this book, or all of this book, I suppose, takes place in the second half of the 20th century, mainly in Budapest and Berlin. And much of this book is interested in the history, sort of post-World War II history of Central Europe. And so what makes this book so interesting to me is its interest in 2 main things. One is the history of Central Europe post-World War II. Its interest in these big historical events like the Hungarian Revolution and the history of Hungary from about 1945 to, say, 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. It's interested in all of that on one side. And then on the other side, this disturbingly grotesque interest in sex. This is the most not safe for work book I've ever read. And I've read George Bataille's The Story of the Eye. Péter Nádas makes Bataille feel tame. Parallel Stories is like if James Joyce had a Tumblr account and wrote fan fiction of Tolstoy, or if Robert Musil and E.L. James wrote a collaborative book. It's insane as this book moves fluidly, and there are plenty of fluids to be found in this book, but as this book moves fluidly between the highest forms of literary creation and the most base human compulsions. The NSFW in the title of this video is kind of a joke, but not really. This is the most graphic book I've ever read. So in the most basic form of literary analysis, you have to ask yourself, why does this book have these two interests? Why is it interested on one hand in the history of Central Europe in the second half of the 20th century? And on the other hand, why is it interested in the most crude aspects of human relationships? Why are we getting a book that on one side deals with Nazism and nationalism and cultural trauma and cultural revolutions, and on the other hand explores eroticism and honestly quite grotesque sexual acts? Why put into conversation national history, the stuff that people often talk about, and the stuff that no one wants to talk about, stuff like sexual urges, sexual fantasies, masturbation, etc. Politics on one side and eros on the other. Okay, I'm not going to try to summarize this book at all. There are way too many narrative strands, each one complicated enough to be its own novel. But this book opens, as many good books do, with a dead body. And let me just read the opening paragraph really quick. In that memorable year when the famous Berlin Wall came down, a corpse was discovered in the Tiergarten, not far from the graying marble statue of Queen Louisa. This happened a few days before Christmas. One of our main characters, I'm not really sure what to call them, one of our recurring characters, one of our characters whom this book orbits, right, whose existence this book orbits. His name is Düring, and he stumbles across this body, or he might be complicit in this body in some way. We're not exactly sure yet, but he stumbles across this body while on a run, and he reports it. And the police come and they interview him, and this doctor named Dr. Kirnast investigates this body, and he performs an autopsy on this body, which any book that begins with an autopsy, you can read into that quite clearly, as this book is almost explicitly an autopsy of 20th century Central Europe. But this doctor investigates and studies this body in such immense detail. And the stuff that he studies isn't like the hands and the face of this body. It's the secret parts of the body that he investigates. He looks quite closely at parts of the body that, are making me uncomfortable to talk about. And what Dr. Kirnast does is he maps onto this body and he creates this narrative for this person. All of these kind of sexual acts, these sexual fantasies, he begins mapping all of this onto the body, right? He induces all of this information by studying this body. And at times the doctor is actually, attracted to this dead body as he fantasizes about this dead body's sexual life and all these different things. There is always this hypersexual fantasy going on with all of our characters. It's very kind of Marquis de Sade. So immediately we're introduced to this concept. And it doesn't just end with the dead body. The sort of mystery around this body fades away quite quickly from the narrative after the first 50 pages. And every couple hundred pages will come back to this mystery, but it sort of sets the stage and then leaves it at that. But Düring, in the late 1980s, when this narrative is taking place, is a central character, and we keep coming back to him, but kind of briefly. He does have this interesting family history. His father is an important character, and the connections between the young Düring and the older Düring are fascinating, as the young Düring will often dream, but he'll dream as if he is his father. Very, very bizarre. But perhaps if this book has real main characters, it's these three characters that we meet that are in a completely different storyline taking place in the 1960s. And these characters are Hans von Wolkenstein, August Schleer, and Andres Roth. And these three men all work as translators in this sort of underground secretive job that we don't really understand what exactly they're doing. It's slowly kind of given to us. But these three men are all very, very different. They're all of different nationalities. They all speak different languages. But of course, they're all translators. So they're often speaking in kind of broken Hungarian to each other, or broken German to each other. And because of all these reasons, they differ quite a bit politically. And there's all this sexual tension between these three characters as they harbor their own fantasies and their own traumas and their own histories. And they confide in each other and all sorts of things like that. And there's always this sexual tension. The first time we meet these three characters, they're all hanging out in a bathhouse, for instance. These three characters are all very, very interesting. And there's all these parallels between them, of course, because this book is always interested in parallelism and in these sort of webs of connections between characters. But I think I'll have more to say about the friendship between these characters in the next two videos. What I want to focus on for the rest of the video, I think, is looking at one of these characters, Auguste, and his relationship with this woman named Jean-Javert, or Gonjavert. I'm probably mispronouncing her name. I apologize. Jean-Javert is a working class woman who has had a pretty tough life, but she aspires to be a famous singer. And her relationship with Auguste is pretty fraught. Auguste occasionally doesn't like her at all. It seems like they're breaking up, and Auguste is often very cruel to her in a lot of ways. But one of the main narrative strands in the first volume of this book is these 4 nights of sex between Auguste and Jean-Javert, sort of earlier on in their relationship than I think the rest of this narrative takes place. And it sounds very bizarre, but this is one of, for me, the best parts of this book so far. It's this about 100-page section of this book that just focuses on them as they lay in bed and have sex over and over and over again for 4 days straight. And the narrative doesn't just focus on them for the entire 100 pages. It'll focus on them for like 20 pages and then jump away to another narrative and then come back to it and pick up where it left off. But this section goes on and on and on. And it gets pretty weird pretty quickly as Jean-Javert's landlady at one point comes into the room. She's often outside of the room listening to them because they're living in an apartment with very thin walls. But her landlady will come in and she starts talking to them as they're not stopping. So we get all these pretty weird interactions. But throughout this section, what we get are both insanely graphic descriptions of the sexual acts that they're doing, and we get sucked into the thought processes of both of these characters, and we jump between them as we learn a lot about the hopes and fears and desires of Auguste, and then we'll just get sucked into Jean-Javert's head. Again, it's very modernist in this way, in that it jumps between these characters very, very fluidly. And again, it's difficult to tell often when a character is, or I guess it's not wholly difficult, you can figure it out, but occasionally you kind of forget when a character is speaking versus when they're just thinking the things that they're thinking. Because we'll get pages and pages of just thought, and then what they say, will contradict that thought. And this scene is pretty blatantly Freudian in a lot of ways, but I don't think it's necessarily just kind of this unconscious made manifest. There's something very political going on here. Remember, this isn't a book that's just about sex or just about, base human instincts. It's also a book about geopolitics. And there are so many passages that we could look at. And some of them, call me a Puritan if you want. Some of them I honestly don't even feel comfortable reading out loud. They're very, very detailed. And I won't go into all of those details because again, I don't know how to talk about them. But if you can think about it, it's described somewhere in this book. But let me just read this passage. At this point, they've been going at it for some time. And this passage is quite long, so feel free to skip ahead. But I do think it's doing a lot of interesting things, and I think it illustrates a lot about this connection between the sex that this book is so interested in and the politics that are just behind all of this bodily interactions. The passage just reads, "They had been keeping each other captives like this for 4 days. They barely slept, hardly ate or drank anything, parted only for hours, and then continued as if in the next moment, against their will, they'd have to leave each other forever. They left not a single moment unfulfilled. Still, Jean-Javert had not had time to go on a journey of exploration across the man's body. For that, she'd have had to let go of him, if only for a little while, and be at some distance from him. She could not afford to. On the contrary. The man, however, wanted to do a number of things, simultaneously with her, but had to be content with only one, which he found not enough. They could not tear themselves away from each other's proximity. With their kisses, they kept wrestling each other down, falling or dropping somewhere on the table or bed. If they couldn't stay on their feet, they would plop into a chair or onto the floor, even in the kitchen, and regain their full bodily security only when the man entered her again. They barely glanced at each other before they were at it again, which made their closeness permanent. Yet, each time it seemed to them as if it were happening for the first time. Silence reigned. They held their breath. At most, their blood was circulating. They had no previous practice or experience with each other, and oddly, they did not gain anything like it now, which made them lose not only their sense of time, but also any interest in relating to the outside world. They became the only possible external world for each other, and thus could not be, in and of themselves, so important to each other that they might, for some trivial reason, interfere with the time of the total occurrence. In fact, neither of them had a precise image of where or of what quality the other one was, because their awareness was in their hands, or their lips and tongues, or the fine hairs of the nostrils. They only intuited where one of them ended and the other began. So I hope that illustrates that Nádas is doing a lot of things with this sex. I mean, this whole scene that, again, is about 100 pages, could have been edited down quite a bit, but there's something very political going on here. William T. Vollmann, who wrote an excellent review of this novel, and based on his review, I think he liked it a lot in a lot of ways and found it tedious in some other ways, which is pretty on par for Vollmann, because that's how I feel with Vollmann. But if you've read The Lucky Star by William T. Vollmann, which I read, and it's a great book, you can probably see that there are some similarities in their focus on the kind of base human compulsions of sex. Both of these novels are very, very interested in this idea. But Vollmann writes of this scene, in the very general scene of Auguste and Jean going at it for 4 days. He writes of this scene, quote, "Just as in Marx, the cultural superstructure is founded upon a half-invisible economic substructure, so in Nádas, the neuroses of the personality owe something to the psychoses of the society behind it." So within this intimate and often grotesque scene is not only just immense characterization of both Auguste and Jean Javert, but there's this window into a political and social milieu that, for better or worse, is paired with eroticism, the most base form of human action. On the one hand, we have all of this philosophy and analysis of geopolitics and socioeconomic movements in these countries, and all these massive historical events that created the modern day Hungary in which Péter Nádas is writing in, and all of this psychoanalysis of characters. All of that's on one hand, and then on the other hand, we get a description of two characters pissing on each other in sexual glee. And on top of this parallel, there is this continual interrogation of the connection between pleasure and pain throughout the scene, as they're both kind of experiencing all of these bodily pleasures, but they're doing it too much, and to the point where it begins hurting both of them. And if you'll bear with me, let me just read one more paragraph, as I think this is doing some pretty interesting things. They've both been climaxing for a while now, right? I think this is on day 4. The pleasure has turned into pain for both of them, but they can't stop. And we just get this passage. "A face in ecstasy is frightening. The reason one can look at it without aversion and disgust is that in the distortions of another person's face, one can catch a glimpse of what one's own greediness and selfishness look like. It is like stepping into a hall of mirrors. A person can see his or her own visage, even if it is stronger and more violent, or perhaps weaker and gentler than their own self-image. And at the same time, their inner pictures were becoming so powerful that looking at each other steadfastly was to no avail. Seeing each other so exposed, so devoid of dignity, beauty, and charm, they couldn't keep their independent inner pictures from ceasing to refer to, no, almost completely excluding each other. And there was more. They were both thinking very actively and clearly, and this also seemed to have little to do with their amorous activities, or in any case, they could no longer locate and secure the contact points of thought and sensations. The redoubled the redoubled double worlds of sensation and thinking, which otherwise blend, seep, flow, soar, vanish, or absorb each other, so that one can make way for the other, or, put another way, so that the stronger may gain ascendancy, and the weaker humbly relinquish its position. These worlds were progressing by clambering over each other, making their way forward, over and inside each other, like a coarse greased cogwheel, or a fine clockwork whose gears and levers unconsciously drive a system much larger than itself, something with no name, something the mind cannot comprehend, whose boundaries are invisible, and whose enormous mass cannot be measured. It's pretty obvious to point out, but by talking and describing these two bodies in both mutual pleasure, but also sort of in combat, he's clearly talking about much larger geopolitics. But that description reminds me quite a bit of Peter Hujar's 1960 photographs, The Orgasmic Man, which is, of course, on the cover of Hanya Yanagihara's A Little Life. The closeness between pleasure and pain in this man's visage really maps onto what's going on in this scene. Each face is a mirror in which the other character looks and sees themselves. Look, I'm not sure if this is a good book or not. I'm not sure I would even recommend it. The narrative is messy, it's insanely repetitive, and the prose is occasionally awkward and honestly, occasionally quite juvenile. But at the same time, overall, I found the prose to be absolutely hypnotic, just absolutely intoxicating. I also very much like the prose of Carlo Knausgaard, whom a lot of sort of prose stylist experts don't really like that much. So take this for what you will. I might not be the best judge of prose, but there's something about this narrative that has completely enveloped me the past few days. There's something about its intimacy, which is occasionally too intimate, to be clear. But there's something so naked to this book that I'm really having trouble looking away. It's such a unique and compelling way to explore this massive history of the second half of the 20th century in Central Europe. Let me know if you have read parallel stories. Seriously, I've been trying to find like secondary literature on this book, and it seems like there are just a bunch of reviews in popular newspapers that either say it's the greatest thing, the greatest epic of all time, only on par with War and Peace or something like that, or it's people just saying how much they hate it and how like navel-gazing they found it. I'm interested to see if other people have read this and what they think. And let me know if you like this kind of video. Again, I should be doing the next 2 volumes of this as I make my way through it. This is a novel that, for better or worse, wherever you fall on that spectrum of which you rate this book, I think it demands to be spoken about. So let me know what you think. But for now, thanks for watching.